Hello, I'm Mr. Dollery, and today we're going to be discussing the core ideas of conservatism as one of the core political ideas for the Edexcel specification for A-level politics. So let's start off with a broad definition of conservatism. Broadly speaking, conservatism as an ideology attempts to conserve society as it is and is suspicious of change. In this sense, conservatism values pragmatism over ideological thinking and seeks to adapt its values over time, according to changes in society. This occurring through piecemeal reform rather than radically through revolution. Conservatives also uphold a resistance to change through support for tradition, a belief in human imperfection, and attempts to uphold the organic structure of society. A unifying theme of conservatism is the quest for a realistic conception of order. For example, traditional conservatives appreciate that inequality is inevitable due to this natural order, whilst new right conservatives realism about the nature of the human condition necessitates that authoritarian measures in the social sphere, in the form of neoconservatism, are enacted to ensure that the market remains laissez-faire, in the form of neoliberal economics. It's important to remember that not all conservatives think alike. So whilst broadly we can say that conservatism is an ideology that attempts to conserve society as it is and is suspicious of change, not all conservatives will think alike. So new right thinking within conservatism in the 1970s and 80s challenged much of what traditional conservatism pre-Disraeli had traditionally stood for, as well as challenged One Nation conservatives' commitment to the mixed economy, for example. So let's start off with a broad definition. So looking at pragmatism as a core tenet of conservatism, we'll start with a definition. So the idea of adopting a flexible approach to society with decisions made on the basis of what works. So it comes from the philosophical school of thought based on empiricism, in contrast to rationalism, where decisions should be based on evidence, experience, in contrast to analytical a priori reasoning. So in this sense, conservatives reject ideology, preferring to look at history, experience, and tradition to guide human conduct, rather than relying heavily on abstract principles or ideological dogma. So the previous Tory Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan's middle way, advocated for what he called planned capitalism, which he described as a mixed system which combines state ownership, regulation, or control of certain aspects of economic activity with a drive initiative of private enterprise. So this idea of pragmatism is reflected also in the two quotes below. So Ian Gilmore saying, the wise conservative travels light, and Edmund Burke saying that change is necessary, so change in order to conserve. So the idea that in order for conservatives to remain relevant in the political sphere, especially in a country that becomes more and more progressive over time, the pragmatic and politically astute thing to do is not to die on every hill of principle, but to change and adapt with the times in order to remain politically relevant. And the idea from Burke, change in order to conserve, the idea that you're not going to be able to win every ideological battle, so some principles may have to be watered down, and some policy positions or ideological positions will have to change in order for other aspects to be conserved. So, for example, the monarchy, if we're looking at a transition from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy, a sense that will change the powers of the monarchy, will dilute the powers of the monarchy in order to conserve the monarchy rather than completely abolish it, because they would argue that in an organic society, empirically, we've seen the worth of the monarchy. It survived a very, very long time. Conservatives would say we should keep it. But in order to keep it, as society becomes more progressive, we're going to have to change in order to conserve it. However, it's important to appreciate that the new right are more dogmatic than the post-1945 pragmatic and paternalistic one-nation conservatives of Macmillan or the 19th century Disraeliites. So, for example, from the 1970s, the new right challenged conservative intellectual thought, in particular conservatives' pragmatism over Keynesian economics and the excessive welfare state spending, which they saw as damaging to the economy, society, and most importantly, individual negative liberty. So the new right, informed by neoliberalism in the kind of ideological writings of Hayek and Friedman, advocated for more economic freedom and minimal states, whilst combining these principles with social authoritarianism and hawkish foreign policy, informed by neoliberal thinking. So the new right from the 1970s was willing to reject this pragmatism that had been the kind of precedent, especially from Disraeli in the Tory party, to kind of the 1960s in the kind of post-war consensus. They were very much kind of willing to adopt a new ideology that combined neoliberalism and neoconservatism that was based on these principles of minimal state, economic freedom, less red tape, less bureaucracy, shrunken down centralized government in conjunction with kind of authoritarianism in the social sphere and a promotion of moral values. So the two quotes below kind of emphasize where the new right kind of attempted to take conservatism as it kind of pushed pragmatism to the sidelines. So Thatcher at the Conservative Party conference in 1975 discussing neoliberalism. So let me give you my vision: the state as servant and not as master, the essence of a free economy, and on that freedom all other freedoms depend. So that sense of vision, ideologically positioning the state as the servant and not the master, and that belief and that kind of principled belief that without a laissez-faire economy, other individual liberties can't necessarily be guaranteed. Looking at Bill Kristol in a kind of neoconservatism foreign policy way, so how we talked about the US invasion of Iraq, when he talked about foreign policy on the 20th of February 2003, he said, look, if we free the people of Iraq, we will be respected in the Arab world. I think we will be respected around the world for helping the people of Iraq be liberated. So in this quote, looking at the third tenet of conservatism, tradition. So definition: the accumulated wisdom of past societies, where a connection between the generations is upheld by creating stability, and which enhances human security. For some conservatives, tradition reflects a religious faith that society is shaped by natural law and stabilised by traditions that are God-given. But also for practical reasons, many conservatives defend tradition. So Burke talks about society's social contract between those who are living, those who are dead, and those are to be born. Because as citizens, we have a normative and moral duty to conserve society, to ensure that the wishes of the past are respected, but also to ensure that the aspirations of future generations are guaranteed. And the protection of precedents or tradition helps society nourish social cohesion, linking people to the past and allowing for a communitarian belonging in society to be nourished. So Jonah Goldberg, a US conservative author, talks about how cultures grow on the vine of tradition. Linking back to pragmatism, conservatives believe in empiricism. Tradition is valued as evidencing that particular ways of doing things and particular institutions have demonstrated their worth by being tested by time. Particular ideas have been endorsed by a process of natural selection, and this demonstrates their fitness to survive. Also, tradition is valued by conservatives because it ensures the stability of society's institutions by protecting them against tyranny of the day. So Chesterton in 1908 talks about how tradition refuses to submit to the arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking around. Nevertheless, due to conservatives' pragmatism, tradition is not always a principle that is upheld to the nth degree. They are willing to compromise on certain traditions in order to conserve them in other ways. So this is reflected in the sense that One Nation conservatives appreciate that institutions must change with the times, and Disraeli talks about this in 1867, where he says, in a progressive country, change is constant and you shouldn't resist change, which is inevitable. Conservatives also believe that humans are flawed, which makes them incapable of making good decisions for themselves. So in three ways, conservatives talk about human imperfection. So firstly, humans are psychologically imperfect, so they're psychologically limited, they fear isolation and seek security. And conservatives adopt the Hobbesian belief that individuals will give up liberty for the sake of security. Secondly, conservatives talk about moral imperfection. So religious conservatives in particular believe that human beings are fallen creatures and endowed in original sin. People can only be persuaded to behave in a civilized fashion if they are deterred from expressing their violent and antisocial impulses. So strict law is thus necessarily enforced so that order is upheld and society remains stable. Thirdly, conservatives are concerned about intellectual imperfection. So conservatives are pessimistic of human beings' intellectual capacities. Human rationality is fallible and should be treated with skepticism. So utopian ideas about human nature and society are thus treated with distrust. Goes to Oakeshott's belief that the cure is not worse than the disease. So it might be worth reforming some aspects of society rather than completely changing society through a revolution, because the individuals who came up with these utopian ideas, because human rationality is fallible, they may not necessarily have the best interests at heart. That's why it's important that the conservatives rely on empiricism, tradition, what's come before, because it's tried and tested, rather than these utopian ideas, which rely on a very optimistic view of human nature. So because individuals are fallible, conservatives thus tend to trust in time-tested tradition, experience and history to guide their decisions and how to structure society. Pragmatism and piecemeal reform is thus preferred compared to idealism and revolution. However, it's important to realise that the new right conservatives challenge their sentiment with a moral and intellectual basis in neoliberal philosophy. So their ideas about human perfection and a belief in rationalism. This challenges the pragmatism and adherence to tradition of previous conservative thought. Conservatives also believe in an organic society. So conservatives believe that human beings are security-seeking creatures that are dependent on having roots in society. Humans are codependent on society for stability and security. So conservatives traditionally view society as a living, organic entity. Like a living organism, society has a metaphorical head, heart, brain, and lungs that work in harmony. Unlike machines, organisms are not simply a collection of individual parts, but a fragile, collective set of relationships between and among its parts, which once damaged can result in the organism's death. So conservatives believe that individuals have a social contract to uphold and social obligations to protect and conserve society and its institutions for future generations. This is what previous generations have done for them. Organicism also shapes conservatives' attitudes to particular institutions. These are viewed from a functionalist perspective. Institutions develop and survive for a reason, and this reason is that they contribute to maintaining the larger social whole. However, the New Right challenges conservatives' organic ideas. This is due to the New Right's belief in egoistic individualism. Individuals do not necessarily need to rely on others for their security and well-being, especially not the state. In this sense, society is not organic, but should be based on negative freedom, where individuals are left alone to be free from the obligations and interference of others. So looking at paternalism, let's look at a definition. So the benign power exercised from above by the state that governs in the interests of the people, justified by conservatives because wisdom and experience are unequally distributed in society, and those in authority know best in enacting the common good. Conservatives' commitment to paternalism is rooted in the philosophy of Benjamin Disraeli, and his books Sybil and Coningsby emphasise the principle of social obligation of the upper classes to those less privileged. Paternalistic conservatives of the traditional and one nation tradition hold the organic belief that society is held together by an acceptance of duty and obligations. Whilst appreciating that society is naturally hierarchical, the inequalities of wealth give rise to an inequality of responsibilities. Thus, the wealthy and powerful must shoulder the burden of social responsibility, which in effect is the price of privilege. These ideas were based on the feudal principle of noblesse oblige, the obligation of the aristocracy to be honourable and generous to the less well-off. Traditional conservatives adopt a paternalism that is authoritarian in its approach because the state knows what is best, so the people must do what they are told. So it's in a sense hard paternalism and operates regardless of consent, and thus overlaps with forms of authoritarianism. One nation conservatives see paternalism manifesting itself in the obligations of the wealthy to look after those who are unable to look after themselves. So it's a kind of form of soft paternalism, and is characterised by broad consent on part of those subject to paternalism. So in these senses, there is a kind of patronising element of the top looking after the bottom, but in terms of policy, those subject to the paternalism do largely consent to it. So something like seatbelts is a kind of a common example seen as quite paternalistic, but something that the vast majority of people broadly consent to upholding. In contrast, New Right conservatives, paternalism is an infringement on individual negative liberty. New Right argues that authority is not to be trusted, especially if it's coming from the state, and thus paternalism restricts liberty and contributes to the infantilization of society. So looking at authority and hierarchy, traditional conservatives believe that society is naturally hierarchical, characterised by fixed and established social gradations. Social equality is thus undesirable and unachievable. Power, status, property are always unequally distributed. Traditional conservatives argue that inequality is deep-rooted and an inevitable feature of an organic society, not merely a consequence of individual differences and individual actions. Conservatives believe that government from above in the form of monarchical rule or subservience to class-based leadership and hierarchy should be adopted through unquestioning obedience to ensure social stability. However, the New Right would argue that meritocracy and individual effort in an atomistic society explains social inequality, which can change from generation to generation as a result of individual hard work and effort. Nevertheless, the New Right and traditional conservatives both believe that hierarchy is inevitable. Whilst one nation conservatives understand that there is a natural inequality of wealth and social position, this is justified by a corresponding inequality of social responsibilities. Thus, paternalistic approaches to policy are adopted to justify material inequalities and hierarchy between the classes. For conservatives, authority is established naturally, not as a result of contracts made by free individuals, as liberals would argue. Conservatives believe that authority is necessary and beneficial, as people need guidance, support, and security that comes from knowing where they stand and what is expected of them. All three strands of conservatism, traditional, one nation and New Right, have explicit or illicit respect for authority and hierarchy, as it guarantees social stability. Whilst libertarian conservatives believe in economic individualism and getting government off the back of business, they are not prepared to extend this principle of individual liberty to other aspects of social life. Conservatives, even libertarian socialists, conservatives, have a more pessimistic view of human nature, and thus an authoritarian state is required to maintain public order and ensure that certain forms of hierarchy are respected.